A 50-year marriage that was never actually monogamous by design. A honeymoon phase that started while a wedding ring was still on someone else's finger. A film set romance that outran an already collapsing marriage before the cameras even stopped rolling. Here are 15 Hollywood actresses who couldn't stay faithful. Number 15. Reese Witherspoon. Reese Witherspoon and actor Ryan Phillippe married in 1999 and built one of Hollywood's most closely watched young families over the following 7 years, raising 2 children while both continued establishing successful film careers throughout the early 2000s, with Witherspoon in particular becoming one of the industry's most bankable box office draws, following the success of Legally Blonde in 2001 and Walk the Line in 2005, a performance that would eventually earn her the Academy Award for Best Actress. When the couple announced their separation in 2006, tabloid coverage at the time speculated that Witherspoon's relationship with actor Jake Gyllenhaal, which became public within months of the split, had actually begun before the marriage officially ended, a theory fueled partly by how quickly the two were photographed together following the separation announcement. Witherspoon has never confirmed that timeline publicly, and no definitive evidence has ever surfaced to settle the question one way or the other, with Witherspoon herself generally declining to discuss the specifics of either relationship's timeline in any detail during subsequent interviews, generally redirecting questions about her personal life during that period back toward her professional work instead. Phillippe, for his part, has offered his own competing account over the years, generally suggesting the marriage's problems predated either party's next relationship, without directly accusing Witherspoon of infidelity in his own public statements, and telling one interviewer years later that he preferred not to relitigate the exact circumstances surrounding their divorce, given how much time had passed. What remains clear is the speed of the transition itself, which struck entertainment reporters at the time as unusually fast for 2 people who had spent the better part of a decade building a public image around family stability, a contrast that made the tabloid speculation considerably harder to dismiss outright, especially given how carefully both actors had cultivated a wholesome public image throughout their marriage. Witherspoon and Gyllenhaal's own relationship lasted roughly 2 years before ending in 2009, and Witherspoon went on to marry talent agent Jim Toth in 2011, a marriage that itself ended in divorce in 2023 after 11 years together, a separation Witherspoon addressed only briefly in a public statement without offering further detail about the circumstances involved. Entertainment reporters covering Witherspoon's career throughout this period frequently noted the contrast between how carefully she managed her public image around family and stability, including through her own production company's focus on family-friendly and female-driven content, and the persistent speculation surrounding the exact circumstances of her first divorce, a tension that has followed coverage of her personal life for nearly 2 decades, despite her considerable professional success across film, television, and business ventures during the same stretch of time. A far less ambiguous transition, involving an actress whose romantic pivot from one household to another became a defining storyline of her entire reality television career, kicks off the next entry on this list. Number 14. Halle Berry. Halle Berry married baseball player David Justice in 1993, and the marriage ended in divorce in 1997 amid a wave of tabloid coverage that included allegations of infidelity circulating on both sides, with Justice himself later making public comments suggesting Berry's own involvement with someone else had contributed directly to the marriage's end, comments he made during radio interviews years after the split that reignited public interest in a divorce that had already faded from headlines. Reports at the time described Berry as having become involved with another man before the divorce was finalized, though Berry herself has generally declined to discuss the specific circumstances of the split in detail during interviews over the following decades, preferring instead to focus on what she has described as broader lessons learned from an early, difficult marriage that began when she was still in her mid-20s and still establishing herself as a leading actress following her breakout role in Boomerang. Berry's next marriage, to singer Eric Benet, beginning in 2001, ended in 2005, following Benet's own public admission of infidelity during their relationship, a reversal of the earlier tabloid narrative that had focused primarily on Berry, and one that Barry has referenced in later interviews as having been particularly painful given the earlier round of public scrutiny she had already endured following her first divorce. Barry has spoken more openly in later interviews about both marriages as difficult, formative chapters of her personal life, generally framing herself as someone who learned hard lessons about trust across both relationships rather than directly relitigating who was responsible for each one's collapse, telling one interviewer that she had come to see her 20s and 30s as a period of learning who she genuinely was outside the context of whichever relationship she happened to be in at the time. Barry went on to have 2 children with subsequent partners, actor Gabriel Aubry and actor Olivier Martinez, both relationships that also ended amid their own custody disputes and public disagreements, though neither generated the same specific infidelity allegations that had defined her 2 earlier marriages, with Barry's later relationship struggles generally attributed by entertainment press to co-parenting disagreements rather than any renewed accusations of unfaithfulness on either side. Barry has continued discussing the emotional aftermath of both early marriages and interviews well into her career's later decades, describing a gradual process of learning to trust her own judgment about relationships rather than the public narratives that had followed each of her divorces, and telling one interviewer that she considered her willingness to keep marrying, despite 2 very public failures, evidence of an enduring optimism about love rather than a pattern worth feeling ashamed of. Justice, for his part, has continued to work occasionally as a baseball broadcaster and analyst in the decades since the divorce, generally declining opportunities to discuss the marriage in detail during his broadcasting career, though he did address the split more directly during a handful of radio appearances in the mid-2000s, comments that reignited tabloid interest in a story that had otherwise mostly faded from active coverage by that point, prompting a fresh round of entertainment reporting that revisited the original divorce filings and contemporaneous press coverage from 1997. A far more openly acknowledged transition defined the next entry, in which a longtime television partnership ended abruptly once one half of the couple met someone new. Number 13. Anne Heche. Anne Heche was in a highly publicized relationship with television host Ellen DeGeneres beginning in 1997, one of the most visible same-sex celebrity relationships in American media at the time, with the 2 making a notably public debut as a couple at a White House Correspondents' Dinner that same year. A moment widely regarded as a significant step forward for LGBTQ visibility in mainstream entertainment coverage, given how few celebrity couples of that kind had appeared so openly in such a formal, nationally televised setting before. In 2000, Heche abruptly ended the relationship after meeting cameraman Coley LaFoon on the set of a music video, a transition that unfolded quickly enough to generate significant tabloid coverage given how established the DeGeneres relationship had appeared just months earlier, with several outlets at the time openly questioning how a relationship that had seemed so solid could apparently unravel within such a short window. Heche married LaFoon in 2001, and the 2 had a son together before divorcing in 2009, after 8 years of marriage, a union that had itself unfolded largely away from the intense press scrutiny that had defined her relationship with DeGeneres, a contrast Heche noted in later interviews as a genuine relief after years of near-constant public attention. Heche addressed the sudden shift in later interviews with a degree of candor, describing the change as one she herself struggled to fully explain even to those closest to her, without offering extensive additional detail about the overlap between the 2 relationships, generally framing the transition as something that had simply happened rather than something she had carefully planned or anticipated, and telling one interviewer that she had never fully understood the public's continued fascination with the exact sequence of events given how personal the decision had ultimately been. The transition remained one of the most frequently referenced chapters of Heche's personal life in entertainment coverage for years afterward, regardless of how briefly she chose to address it herself, resurfacing repeatedly in retrospectives of her career throughout the following 2 decades, including in coverage following her death in a car accident in August 2022, when numerous outlets revisited the DeGeneres relationship as one of the defining chapters of her public life, alongside her later acting work in film and television. DeGeneres addressed the end of her own relationship with Heche only briefly in public over the years, generally declining to revisit the specific circumstances in detail during her own subsequent television career, though she referenced the relationship's abrupt ending on occasion as one of the more painful chapters of her personal life. Following news of Heche's death in 2022, DeGeneres issued a brief public statement acknowledging the loss, choosing to focus on Heichi's talent as a performer rather than revisiting the specific circumstances that had ended their relationship more than 2 decades earlier. A film director, rather than a talk show host, found himself on the losing end of a similarly abrupt transition several years later, once his wife's new relationship became public, before their own marriage had formally ended. Number 12. Susan Sarandon. Susan Sarandon and actor Tim Robbins were partners for more than 2 decades, raising 2 children together without ever formally marrying, a relationship widely regarded within the industry as one of Hollywood's most stable long-term pairings, and frequently cited as evidence that marriage itself was not a prerequisite for a lasting Hollywood relationship, particularly given how publicly the two had spoken over the years about their shared political activism and creative collaborations, including their joint work on several film projects together. In 2009, the couple announced their separation, and reports soon followed connecting Sarandon to a considerably younger business partner, Jonathan Bricklin, with whom she had been running a ping-pong social club business, and with whom she went on to have a public relationship for several years afterward, a business venture that had begun, according to Sarandon's own account, purely as a professional partnership before evolving into something more personal. Sarandon has generally described the end of her relationship with Robbins in vague terms in interviews, avoiding direct confirmation of any overlap between the two relationships, while acknowledging that her connection with Bricklin developed relatively soon after the separation became public, a timeline that fueled ongoing tabloid speculation, despite her general reluctance to elaborate further, with Sarandon telling one interviewer that she considered the exact timeline a private matter that served no one's interest to dissect publicly. The age gap between Sarandon and Bricklin, more than 3 decades, drew considerable tabloid attention in its own right, adding another layer of scrutiny to a transition that already carried the weight of ending one of Hollywood's longest unmarried partnerships, one that had itself begun decades earlier under similarly complicated circumstances involving Robbins, who was still involved with actress Rebecca Miller when he and Sarandon first met and began their own relationship in the mid-1980s, a detail that added a layer of symmetry to the eventual end of their own decades-long partnership. Sarandon and Bricklin's relationship eventually ended around 2015, and Sarandon has continued working steadily in film and television in the years since, generally declining to discuss her personal life in significant detail during subsequent interviews, treating the entire period surrounding her separation from Robbins as a chapter she preferred to leave largely unexamined in public, even as entertainment reporters continued periodically revisiting the story whenever her name resurfaced in coverage of other subjects. Robbins himself has occasionally addressed the end of the relationship in later interviews, generally offering a measured, philosophical view of how 2 decades together had ultimately run their course, without directly disputing any account of the timing surrounding Sarandon's subsequent relationship, a restraint that stood in contrast to how publicly some other former partners featured elsewhere on this list have chosen to address similarly complicated endings, several of whom used memoirs, podcasts, or televised interviews to offer far more detailed accounts than Robbins ever seemed inclined to share with the public himself. A far more openly acknowledged transition, one that unfolded on the set of a modest television film rather than a major studio release, defined the next entry on this list, involving 2 working actors whose personal decisions ended up reshaping both of their families almost overnight. Number 11. Tori Spelling. Tori Spelling was married to writer Charlie Shanahan, and actor Dean McDermott was married to actress Mary Jo Eustace when the two met on the set of the television film Mind Over Murder in 2005, a made-for-TV production that neither actor had expected to reshape both of their personal lives so dramatically, and one that received relatively little attention itself compared to the personal fallout that followed its production. According to accounts from both Spelling and McDermott given in later interviews, the two began a relationship almost immediately during filming, while both were still legally married to their respective spouses, a connection Spelling has since described in her own writing as feeling immediate and overwhelming from their very first scenes together, comparing the intensity of the initial attraction to nothing she had experienced in her prior marriage. Spelling and Shania divorced later that year, as did McDermott and Eustace, and Spelling and McDermott married in 2006, going on to have 5 children together before eventually divorcing themselves in 2024 amid McDermott's own separate infidelity revealed publicly during their later marriage, a development many entertainment reporters noted carried an ironic symmetry given how the relationship itself had first begun nearly 2 decades earlier under nearly identical circumstances. Spelling has spoken candidly in her own reality television projects and memoirs about how quickly and publicly the original affair unfolded, generally acknowledging the pain it caused both of their previous spouses without offering extensive justification for the timing. And Eustace herself later wrote her own memoir, touching on the experience of losing her marriage under such public circumstances, describing the period as one of the most disorienting of her life, given how quickly her entire domestic situation had changed. Spelling has continued to discuss the eventual collapse of her own marriage to McDermott in subsequent reality programming, drawing occasional comparisons in entertainment press between the circumstances of that ending and the circumstances that had originally brought the two of them together nearly 20 years earlier. Fans and entertainment commentators following Spelling's public life over the following 2 decades have frequently pointed to the parallel structure of her marriage's beginning and end as a particularly striking example of how quickly circumstances can repeat themselves within a single relationship, with several outlets specifically noting that McDermott's own later infidelity involved a colleague from a production he was working on at the time, echoing the exact dynamic that had first brought Spelling and McDermott together back in 2005. A far higher stakes version of the same dynamic played out decades earlier and thousands of miles away, involving a movie star whose personal life became entangled with the biggest entertainment phenomenon of the era. Number 10, Jada Pinkett Smith. Jada Pinkett Smith married actor Will Smith in 1997, and the couple built one of the most publicly discussed marriages in Hollywood over the following decades, raising 2 children while both continued building substantial careers in film, television, and music, with Pinkett Smith establishing herself as both an actress and, later, a talk show host through her Red Table Talk series, which frequently addressed candid, personal subjects rarely discussed so openly by other celebrity couples. In 2020, Pinkett Smith addressed rumors directly on her Facebook Watch series Red Table Talk, confirming that she had a romantic relationship with musician August Alsina during a period around 2015 and 2016, describing it as what she called an entanglement rather than using more conventional terms for the relationship, a word choice that quickly became a subject of widespread commentary and internet mockery in the days following the broadcast, spawning countless memes and parody videos that continued circulating online for years afterward. Pinkett Smith stated during the discussion that she and Will Smith had been separated at the time, having reached what she described as an understanding that each was free to pursue other relationships during that specific period, a claim that added considerable complexity to how the public understood the couple's marriage more broadly, particularly given how the two had continued presenting themselves as a united couple in public appearances throughout that same window of time. Will Smith, participating in the same broadcast, largely corroborated her account, describing his own complicated feelings about learning the details, even given the arrangement both had apparently agreed to beforehand, acknowledging on camera that hearing Alsina's own account of the relationship in a separate interview had been genuinely difficult for him despite the arrangement, and that processing those feelings had required considerable personal work on his part. The couple has remained legally married in the years since, addressing the relationship's complicated structure repeatedly in subsequent interviews without ever fully resolving public confusion about exactly how open their arrangement was during that specific window of time, a level of transparency about their marriage that remained unusual even by modern celebrity standards, with both Smiths continuing to discuss the broader concept of their unconventional marital arrangement in interviews, well after the initial controversy had faded from headlines. Pinkett Smith published her own memoir, Worthy, in 2023, further detailing the complicated internal dynamics of her marriage across multiple chapters, including additional discussion of periods of separation the couple had experienced privately before ever publicly confirming any of it through Red Table Talk. The book generated its own round of renewed media attention, with several outlets specifically noting how much additional context Pinkett Smith provided about her own state of mind during the Alsina relationship, compared to what she had shared during the original 2020 broadcast, adding further depth to a story that had already generated years of public fascination and speculation. A case from decades earlier involved far less ambiguity about consent or arrangement, centered instead on a sultry screen icon whose rumored affair with a co-star became one of the most persistently repeated stories in Hollywood gossip history, whether or not it was ever confirmed. Number 9. Rita Hayworth. Rita Hayworth was married to businessman Edward Judson, who also functioned as her manager and was widely credited with orchestrating much of her early screen image, including her name change from Margarita Cancino and a series of appearance changes, including electrolysis treatments to raise her hairline, when she filmed 1942's My Gal Sal opposite actor Victor Mature, a film that arrived during the peak of Hayworth's rise as one of Columbia Pictures' most valuable contract stars. Contemporary Hollywood gossip columns of the era widely reported a romantic connection between Hayworth and Mature, developing during production, speculation that persisted for years afterward in fan magazines and later biographical accounts of Hayworth's life, with the rumor becoming so persistent that it was frequently referenced in later profiles of both actors, regardless of how little either party ever formally addressed it. Neither Hayworth nor Mature ever publicly confirmed the affair in detail, and some biographers have since suggested that Judson himself may have tolerated or even quietly encouraged public speculation about Hayworth's romantic life as a form of publicity for her rising career, a practice not uncommon in the tightly managed studio system of the era, where a manufactured or exaggerated romance could generate exactly the kind of headlines a rising star's studio wanted during a major film release, particularly for an actress whose entire public identity had been so deliberately constructed by the men managing her career. Hayworth divorced Judson in 1943, citing his controlling behavior over both her finances and personal life throughout their marriage, marrying Orson Welles the following year, the first of what would become 5 marriages across her lifetime, each surrounded by its own round of tabloid speculation about the circumstances of its beginning, a pattern that continued through her later marriages to Prince Ali Khan and singer Dick Haymes, both of which similarly generated public fascination, with the exact timeline connecting the end of one relationship to the beginning of the next. Hayworth's later years were complicated by health struggles that went undiagnosed for years, with what was eventually determined to be early-onset Alzheimer's disease, frequently mistaken by the public and press at the time for alcoholism, a misunderstanding that added considerable pain to an already difficult final chapter of her life, and that biographers have since pointed to as a tragic coda to a career defined so heavily by public speculation about her private relationships, a diagnosis that only came to light publicly after her daughter, Princess Yasmin Aga Khan, began speaking about her mother's condition to raise broader awareness of the disease. An even more persistent rumor from the same golden age of Hollywood gossip involved 2 of the era's biggest stars, a rumored affair so widely repeated over the decades that it eventually became treated by much of the public as accepted fact, despite neither party ever formally acknowledging it, and despite the 2 of them remaining, by nearly every account, genuinely close friends who continued expressing affection for one another publicly for the rest of both of their lives. Number 8. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford and Clark Gable co-starred together in 8 films across their overlapping careers at MGM during the 1930s, and Hollywood gossip columns of the era persistently linked the 2 romantically during periods when both were married to other people, most notably during Crawford's marriage to actor Franchot Tone in the mid-1930s, and Gable's own marriage to Rhea Langham during the same general period, a coincidence of timing that made the rumors considerably more difficult for either studio to dismiss outright, given how frequently the pair were cast opposite one another. The rumored affair became one of the most durable pieces of classic Hollywood lore, repeated across decades of biographies, documentaries, and retrospectives about both stars, treated by many later writers as an open secret of the studio era, despite the lack of any direct confirmation from either party involved, with some biographers going so far as to describe the connection between the 2 as an unconsummated love affair that both actors carried with them privately for the rest of their respective careers. Neither Crawford nor Gable ever publicly confirmed a physical relationship beyond their professional partnership, though both acknowledged in separate interviews over the years that a genuine personal connection existed between them, dating back to their earliest film together in 1931, with Crawford in particular describing Gable in later interviews as someone she had cared for deeply throughout both of their careers, a sentiment she reportedly repeated privately to friends well into her later decades. Crawford's own daughter, Christina, whose later memoir, Mommy Dearest, reshaped much of the public's understanding of her mother's private life, wrote that Crawford spoke about Gable with unusual warmth throughout her life, without ever directly claiming the two had crossed into a physical affair during either of their respective marriages, a distinction Christina herself noted she found significant, given how candidly her mother had discussed other relationships over the years. The rumor's persistence, regardless of its ultimate truth, became a defining piece of Hollywood folklore surrounding two of the studio era's most bankable stars, illustrating just how thoroughly gossip and genuine documented fact could blend together within the tightly managed publicity machine of the period, a blending that later biographers have said makes definitively separating fact from studio-cultivated myth nearly impossible this many decades removed from the events themselves. Crawford herself outlived Gable by roughly 15 years, and in interviews given in the years following his death in 1960, she continued speaking of him with what several journalists at the time described as noticeably more genuine emotion than she typically displayed when discussing other former co-stars or romantic interests from her career, a detail some biographers have cited as indirect but suggestive evidence that whatever existed between the two of them ran deeper than either was ever willing to formally acknowledge. A case involving considerably less ambiguity unfolded around the same general period among Europe's own aristocratic social circles, centered on an actress whose reputation for numerous overlapping relationships eventually became as central to her public identity as any single film role she ever actually appeared in. Number 7. Zsa Zsa Gabor. Zsa Zsa Gabor married her second husband, hotel magnate Conrad Hilton, in 1942, and by the early 1950s had become romantically linked in the press with Dominican diplomat and playboy Porfirio Rubirosa, who was himself married to heiress Doris Duke at the time their relationship reportedly began, a connection that placed two of the era's wealthiest and most talked-about social circles directly in conflict with one another and generated headlines across both American and European gossip publications. Gabor and Hilton divorced in 1946, well before the Rubirosa relationship became publicly prominent, though Gabor's overall reputation across the following decades became defined by a pattern of relationships that frequently overlapped with existing marriages on one side or the other, a reputation she rarely attempted to soften in public and, by many accounts, actively cultivated as part of her broader celebrity persona. Gabor married a total of 9 times across her lifetime, a figure she often referenced with self-deprecating humor in interviews, famously joking that she was an excellent housekeeper, since every time she left a man, she kept his house, a line she reportedly delivered so often in interviews that it became one of the most frequently quoted lines ever attributed to her. Her relationship history, including her association with Rubirosa and numerous other prominent men of the era, became so central to her public persona that it frequently overshadowed her actual film career, turning her personal life itself into a kind of ongoing performance that Gabor appeared to embrace rather than resist throughout her decades in the public eye, cultivating a brand built explicitly around glamour, wealth, and an unapologetic approach to romance that few other actresses of her generation were willing to adopt so openly, with Gabor herself frequently telling interviewers that she considered her many marriages and relationships simply an honest reflection of how thoroughly she believed in love, rather than something requiring any apology or explanation. Gabor's younger sister, actress Ava Gabor, and her older sister, Magda Gabor, both similarly built public personas around glamorous romantic histories, leading entertainment writers of the era to frequently discuss the Gabor sisters collectively as a kind of dynasty built around unapologetic, headline-generating romance, rather than treating Zaza's own reputation as an isolated phenomenon, separate from her family's broader public image, with all three sisters combining for well over 20 marriages across their respective lifetimes. A family record that entertainment historians have described as unmatched by any other set of Hollywood siblings from their generation, a distinction the sisters themselves reportedly found more amusing than embarrassing whenever it came up in interviews. A far more consequential case, involving an actress whose transition from one husband to another played out inside one of the most closely watched celebrity marriages in American history, one that unfolded not in a Beverly Hills mansion, but inside the walls of Graceland itself, dominates the middle portion of this list. Number 6. Priscilla Presley. Priscilla Presley married Elvis Presley in 1967, and the couple had one daughter, Lisa Marie, born exactly 9 months later, before their marriage began deteriorating through the early 1970s amid Elvis's own well-documented struggles and increasingly separate lives within their Graceland household, with Elvis spending much of his time on tour or in Las Vegas, while Priscilla remained largely at home, managing their daughter's upbringing and the daily operations of their expansive estate. In 1972, Priscilla began a relationship with her karate instructor, Mike Stone, a connection that developed while she and Elvis were still legally married, though their marriage had already grown deeply strained, with Priscilla later describing herself at the time as feeling profoundly lonely, despite being married to one of the most famous men in the world. A loneliness, she has said, intensified specifically because of how isolated her life at Graceland had become compared to Elvis's constant travel and public visibility. Priscilla has spoken candidly about the relationship in her own memoir, Elvis and Me, describing Stone as offering a kind of attention and presence she had stopped receiving within her marriage, during a period when Elvis's own behavior had become increasingly erratic, including his growing dependence on prescription medication, a dynamic Priscilla has said she did not fully understand the severity of until years after their divorce, when broader public awareness of Elvis's health struggles increased significantly. Priscilla and Elvis separated in 1972 shortly after the relationship with Stone began, and their divorce was finalized in October 1973, with both parties reportedly remaining on cordial terms throughout the proceedings, despite the circumstances that had precipitated the split, a dynamic Priscilla has attributed partly to their shared commitment to co-parenting Lisa Marie without unnecessary conflict. Priscilla went on to build her own acting career in the years that followed, most notably in television's Dallas and the Naked Gun film franchise, while Stone largely remained out of the public eye, having been reported by Presley biographers as receiving direct threats from Elvis's own circle following the affair's revelation, a detail that has continued to surface in retrospectives, examining the more troubling aspects of Elvis's inner circle during that period of his life. Priscilla and Elvis reportedly remained close after the divorce, with Elvis continuing to call her regularly right up until his death in August 1977, a friendship Priscilla has described in later interviews as genuinely important to her, despite everything that had led to their separation 5 years earlier. Priscilla has continued to serve as a steward of Elvis's legacy in the decades since his death, overseeing Graceland's operations and the broader Elvis Presley Enterprises brand, while also raising their daughter, Lisa Marie, largely on her own following the divorce. In interviews given decades after the Stone affair became public, Priscilla has generally expressed no regret over the decision, describing it instead as a necessary act of self-preservation during a marriage that had left her feeling increasingly invisible within a household almost entirely organized around Elvis's own career and inner circle. Following Lisa Marie's own death in January 2023, Priscilla addressed the loss publicly on numerous occasions, and interviews conducted during that period frequently revisited the broader arc of her relationship with Elvis, including the circumstances of their eventual divorce, treating her decision to leave the marriage decades earlier as part of a longer, more complicated family history that continued shaping the Presley family well into a third generation. A modern case that unfolded under similarly intense media scrutiny involved a pop culture icon whose new relationship became public before her marriage to a previous co-star had technically ended, generating headlines that dominated entertainment coverage for months. Number 5. Jennifer Lopez. Jennifer Lopez married choreographer Chris Judd in September 2001, Following a relatively brief courtship that had itself drawn significant tabloid attention, given how quickly the relationship had progressed from working relationship to marriage, with the two having met while Judd choreographed one of Lopez's music videos earlier that same year. While still married to Judd, Lopez began filming 2002's giggly opposite actor Ben Affleck, and reports of a romantic connection between the two co-stars began circulating in entertainment media well before Lopez's divorce from Judd was formally announced in June 2002, with paparazzi photographs of the two together fueling speculation throughout the early months of that year and prompting increasingly aggressive coverage from tabloid publications eager to document every stage of the developing relationship. Lopez has never publicly detailed the exact timeline of when her relationship with Affleck began relative to the end of her marriage to Judd, and representatives for Lopez at the time generally declined to address the overlap directly when questioned by reporters, offering only general statements about her marriage having already been troubled before the giggly production began. Lopez and Affleck became engaged in November 2002, just months after her divorce from Judd was finalized, in a relationship that quickly became one of the most heavily covered celebrity romances of the decade, complete with a combined nickname, Benifer, that entered the broader pop culture lexicon and set a template for how tabloid media would cover celebrity couples for years afterward, influencing coverage patterns that would later apply to numerous other high-profile pairings across the following 2 decades. The engagement was called off in January 2004, just days before the couple's planned wedding, though Lopez and Affleck would go on to reconnect and eventually marry each other nearly 2 decades later in 2022, closing out one of the most unusual full-circle relationship timelines in modern Hollywood history, before that second marriage itself ended in divorce in 2024, a conclusion that struck many longtime observers of the original saga as a strangely fitting final chapter to a relationship that had first captured public attention more than 20 years earlier. Judd himself has rarely discussed the marriage's end in detail publicly, generally maintaining a low profile in the entertainment industry in the years following the divorce, a contrast to the sustained media attention that continued following both Lopez and Affleck throughout their subsequent relationships and eventual reunion. Lopez has addressed the broader arc of her relationship history in numerous interviews over the years, including in her own 2022 documentary and companion album, both released around the time of her second marriage to Affleck, generally framing the entire saga, including its complicated beginning during her first marriage, as part of a longer personal journey toward better understanding what she genuinely wanted from a partner, rather than as a chapter she considered a mistake in isolation, a framing she has maintained even after her second marriage to Affleck ultimately ended in divorce just 2 years after it began. A far earlier case, unfolding decades before tabloid culture existed in anything resembling its modern form, involved a rising star whose affair with a fellow MGM contract player ended her first marriage entirely. Number 4. Barbara Stanwyck. Barbara Stanwyck was married to actor and comedian Frank Fay, a marriage that had grown increasingly strained by the mid-1930s amid Fay's struggles with alcohol and a career considerably less successful than his wife's rapidly ascending one, a professional imbalance that reportedly bred resentment on Fay's part throughout much of the relationship, with Stanwyck's own film career advancing steadily through the early 1930s, even as Fay's once promising vaudeville and film work continued declining. Around 1935, Stanwyck began a relationship with actor Robert Taylor, at the time one of MGM's most promising young leading men, and, at 24, several years younger than Stanwyck herself, a connection that developed while Stanwyck was still legally married to Fay. Stanwyck divorced Fay in 1935, citing conduct she described in court filings as cruel treatment during their marriage, and she and Taylor married in 1939, following several years of a relationship that studio publicity departments on both sides worked carefully to manage, given the considerable difference in the two actors' respective public images at the time, with MGM reportedly concerned about how quickly the relationship had developed following Stanwyck's divorce, and how it might affect Taylor's own carefully cultivated image as a wholesome, romantic leading man. Stanwyck and Taylor's marriage lasted until 1951, ending in divorce after Taylor's own wartime service and subsequent career changes placed considerable strain on the relationship, along with persistent rumors about Taylor's own fidelity during the marriage that Stanwyck reportedly found increasingly difficult to ignore. Rumors that circulated in gossip columns throughout the late 1940s, even as both actors publicly maintained the marriage was stable. Stanwyck never remarried after the divorce, going on to build one of the longest and most respected careers in Hollywood history across film and television, including her later, Emmy-winning role in the television series The Colbys, while Taylor remained a leading man well into the 1960s before his death from lung cancer in 1969, a loss Stanwyck reportedly took hard despite the years that had passed since their own marriage ended, telling friends privately that she had never fully stopped caring about him, regardless of how their relationship had ultimately concluded. Colleagues who worked with Stanwyck in the decades following her divorce from Taylor frequently described her as guarded about her personal life to an unusual degree, generally declining to discuss either of her two marriages in significant detail across the many interviews she gave throughout a career that stretched into her 80s. A reticence some biographers have connected directly to how publicly both relationships had been dissected by gossip columns during the years they actually unfolded, a level of exposure Stanwyck reportedly found so uncomfortable that she rarely revisited either subject, even with close friends in her later decades, preferring instead to let her professional accomplishments speak for themselves rather than continuing to feed public curiosity about a chapter of her life she considered long since closed. Nothing on this list, however, matches the sheer scale and duration of the arrangement maintained by the next entry, an actress whose marriage technically never ended, even though she conducted dozens of affairs across 5 decades with her husband's full knowledge and, by most accounts, his blessing. Number 3. Marlene Dietrich. Marlene Dietrich married assistant director Rudolf Sieber in 1923, and the two remained legally married until Sieber's death in 1976. A period spanning more than 5 decades and encompassing the entirety of Dietrich's rise from a Berlin cabaret performer to one of the most internationally recognized film stars of the 20th century, a career that spanned both the German and American film industries and included her celebrated collaborations with director Josef von Sternberg throughout the early 1930s. For the vast majority of that marriage, Dietrich and Sieber lived apart, with Sieber eventually settling on a farm in California with his own longtime companion, actress Tamara Matul, while Dietrich pursued an international film career and an extensive, well-documented series of romantic relationships with numerous partners of both genders across multiple continents, a level of openness about her own sexuality that was considered highly unusual for a major film star of her era. Dietrich's documented affairs during her marriage to Sieber included relationships with actors Gary Cooper and John Gilbert, French actor Jean Gabin, and writer Eric Maria Remarque, among many others across her decades of stardom, conducted with what biographers have described as Sieber's full knowledge and, in many cases, his direct approval, given his own parallel relationship maintained with the same degree of openness, an arrangement both parties reportedly viewed as entirely practical, given how rarely their respective careers and lifestyles would have allowed for a conventional cohabiting marriage in the first place. Dietrich reportedly continued sending Sieber financial support and maintaining regular contact throughout their decades of physical separation, treating the marriage as a genuine, lasting partnership in every sense except conventional fidelity or cohabitation, a distinction she reportedly drew clearly and without apparent conflict in her own private correspondence with friends. Dietrich herself referred to Sieber in interviews late in her life as the one man she had never stopped loving, even while acknowledging that neither of them had ever expected or particularly wanted a conventional marriage built around physical exclusivity. Biographers who have examined Dietrich's extensive personal correspondence have noted that she and Sieber continued exchanging warm, detailed letters about their respective lives for decades, treating the physical distance between them as almost incidental to a bond neither ever seriously considered ending through formal divorce. And Dietrich reportedly grieved his death in 1976 with a depth that surprised even some of her closest friends, given how long the two had lived entirely separate daily lives by that point. Dietrich spent much of her own final decades living in near total seclusion in a Paris apartment, rarely appearing in public and conducting most interviews exclusively by telephone, a dramatic contrast to the decades of open, well-documented romantic activity that had defined her younger years, a shift biographers have generally attributed to a combination of declining health and a deliberate choice to control how the public remembered her physical appearance in old age, rather than any change in how she personally viewed the many relationships that had defined her earlier life. The arrangement, unusual even by the standards of Hollywood's most flexible relationships, has been cited repeatedly by biographers as one of the earliest and most fully documented examples of an openly non-monogamous marriage maintained by a major American film star. A far more conventional transition, though no less swift, defined the second-to-last entry on this list, involving a British actress whose marriage to one of the industry's most respected directors ended just as her next relationship began drawing headlines of its own. Number 2. Kate Winslet. Kate Winslet married director Sam Mendes in 2003, and the couple had one son together before announcing their separation in March 2010, ending a marriage that had once been considered one of the more stable pairings among British film industry figures, particularly given both partners' considerable professional success independent of one another, with Winslet having already established herself as one of the most acclaimed actresses of her generation following her Academy Award-winning performance in The Reader in 2008. Within months of the separation becoming public, Winslet began a relationship with Ned Rock'n'Roll, a nephew of businessman Richard Branson, a connection that led to renewed press speculation about exactly how much overlap existed between the end of her marriage to Mendes and the beginning of her relationship with Rock'n'Roll. Winslet has never directly addressed the specific timeline in detail during interviews, generally treating the subject as private in the years since, and declining to respond directly to tabloid speculation about the exact sequence of events, though the speed of the transition drew sustained tabloid attention throughout 2011 and into 2012, as the two were photographed together with increasing frequency, first at private events before eventually appearing together more openly at public engagements. Winslet and Rock'n'Roll married in December 2012, in a small, private ceremony that itself generated headlines, given how quickly it followed her divorce from Mendes, and the two have remained together since, going on to have a child together in 2013, with Winslet occasionally referencing the relationship in later interviews as one that arrived at an unexpected but ultimately welcome point in her life, without ever fully clarifying for the public record exactly when it had actually begun relative to her marriage to Mendes. Mendes himself has rarely discussed the end of the marriage in detail publicly, generally focusing interview discussions on his continued directing career, which has included major franchise work on the James Bond films Skyfall and Spectre in the years following his divorce from Winslet. Winslet has continued building one of the most consistently acclaimed careers of any actress of her generation in the years since her marriage to Rock'n'Roll, earning further award recognition for projects including the television series Mayor of Easttown, while generally maintaining a policy of keeping her personal life, including the exact details of how her relationship with Rock'n'Roll began, out of her public interviews to a degree unusual for a star of her level of fame and media accessibility. A discretion, she has said, reflects a deliberate choice made specifically for the sake of her children's privacy rather than any lingering discomfort about the circumstances themselves. Nothing on this list, however, generated a level of public fascination that outpaced every other case here, quite like the final entry, involving one of the most photographed women in the history of American cinema and an affair conducted in plain view of an entire film crew. Number 1. Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe married playwright Arthur Miller in 1956, a marriage that drew significant attention given the pairing of America's most famous sex symbol with one of its most respected literary figures, a combination the press at the time frequently described using some variation of the phrase beauty and brains, treating the union as an almost improbable meeting of two entirely different corners of American cultural life. By 1960, the marriage had grown deeply strained, worn down by Monroe's demanding filming schedule, her ongoing struggles with anxiety and reliance on prescription medication, and Miller's own difficulty adjusting to a level of fame he had never sought for himself, having built his reputation as a serious playwright rather than a celebrity spouse constantly trailed by photographers. During the filming of Let's Make Love that year, Monroe began a well-documented affair with her co-star, French actor Yves Montand, who was himself married to actress Simone Signoret at the time, with both couples reportedly staying at the same Beverly Hills hotel during the early stages of production, placing all four people in close, repeated proximity to one another throughout the shoot in a coincidence of scheduling that later struck several people involved as almost too dramatic to have been unplanned. The affair became public knowledge within Hollywood circles almost immediately, fueled partly by Monroe's own emotional candor about the relationship to friends and colleagues on set, several of whom later described her as genuinely infatuated with Montan during filming, treating the relationship as considerably more serious than a typical on-set attraction, and reportedly telling at least one close friend that she believed the relationship might eventually lead to marriage once both of their existing marriages had ended. Montan ultimately chose to return to his marriage with Signoret once production wrapped, later describing the relationship in interviews as something that had simply run its course once filming ended, a characterization that reportedly left Monroe deeply hurt given how seriously she had approached the connection, with some biographers describing her reaction to Montan's public dismissal of the affair as one of the more painful personal blows of her final years, compounding difficulties she was already experiencing in both her career and her marriage during that same period. Monroe and Miller's own marriage ended in divorce in January 1961, finalized in Mexico, closing out a relationship that had already been unraveling well before the Montan affair became public, though the affair itself remained one of the most widely discussed chapters of Monroe's personal life in the year before her death in August 1962. A case that continues to be cited by biographers as one of the clearest examples of how thoroughly a single film production could unravel an already fragile Hollywood marriage. Signoret, for her part, remained married to Montan until her own death in 1985, and the two reportedly worked through the affair privately in the years that followed, with Signoret later addressing the period only briefly in her own memoir, choosing largely to leave the details of that chapter of her marriage out of the public record entirely, a discretion that stood in sharp contrast to how extensively the affair had been covered by the press at the time it actually happened. Monroe's own final years following the divorce from Miller and the end of the Montan affair have remained a subject of enormous ongoing public fascination, with biographers continuing to examine her personal correspondence and the accounts of those closest to her for additional insight into her state of mind during that period. The Montan affair itself has continued to surface repeatedly in documentaries, biographies, and retrospective coverage of Monroe's life, released across the more than 6 decades since her death, treated consistently as one of the clearest examples available of how personally and publicly devastating a single film production's romantic entanglement could become for one of the most photographed women in the history of American entertainment. A legacy that has followed the story of Let's Make Love far more persistently than any discussion of the film's modest critical reception at the time of its original release, with retrospectives on Monroe's life continuing to reference the affair even in coverage produced for entirely new generations of viewers who have never seen the film itself. Taken together, the 15 women profiled across this list span nearly a century of American entertainment. From the earliest years of the studio system through the age of social media confessionals broadcast directly to millions of followers, and their stories illustrate just how consistently the same basic dynamics, desire, timing, secrecy, and eventual public reckoning have repeated themselves across radically different eras of Hollywood history, regardless of how dramatically the surrounding media landscape has changed in the decades between Barbara Stanwyck's earliest scandal and Jada Pinkett Smith's own televised confession. From gossip columns typed out on Deadline to broadcasts streamed instantly to phones held in millions of hands around the world. What has stayed constant across every decade covered here is not the method of exposure, but the underlying human reality itself. A marriage strained past its breaking point, a connection formed somewhere it was never supposed to form, and eventually, a public that could not seem to look away no matter how many decades separated one scandal from the next. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.